Today I'm going to focus on the three sonatas for piano and violin, the Opus 30 set, which were published in the spring of 1803. And I think it would be good, before we look in detail at the materials that Beethoven worked with and left for us to play with, I think it's a good idea to get a sense of the world in which these sonatas appeared. Just to say that I've put a link, if you still want to hear anything by the time I finish with you, to my recordings of these pieces sitting in the resource page, so you can have fun with those later. But I wanted to set the scene of Vienna, and one way to do that before a bit of text would be something from the middle of the second movement of the last of those sonatas, this extraordinary melody. And the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung wrote of the Lent of the year 1803, quote, "The amusements of the Viennese after Carnival. Games or music are the soul of social occasions. The dominating games are whist, Boston, ombre, tarot, and preference. Games of chance are partly forbidden because of Lent, and partly not appropriate to the spirit of a nation that severely gets carried away with heated passions. There are frequently amateur concerts at which unceremonious amenities prevail." Here it gets interesting. They usually begin with a quartet by Haydn or Mozart, then an air by Salieri or Peer, then a fortepiano piece with or without accompaniment. Then the concert usually closes with a chorus or something like that from a popular opera. The most excellent pieces that were admired at the last carnival were a new quintet by Beethoven, which was brilliant and serious, full of deep meaning and character, but now and then too harsh, here and there sublime leaps in the manner of this composer. Then follows a quartet by Ebel, dedicated to the Empress, light in character and full of refinement. Recently, Beethoven has been engaged by the Theater an der Wien at a considerable salary, and there he will soon produce an oratorio of his work Christ on the Mount of Olives. Among the artists on the violin, the most distinguished are Clement, Schuppanzig, and Luigi Tomazzini. Clement, leader of the orchestra and der Wien, is an excellent concerto player. Schuppanzig, on the other hand, performs quartets very agreeably. Great artists on the piano are Beethoven, Hummel, Madden Auenhammer, and many more. These sonatas, of course, are forte piano pieces with accompaniment. And I keep talking about that, but I think it's worth saying this. Violinists have a problem with this usually. And it's fascinating to see the salon pieces being described consist of a combination of pieces. One of these, a sonata with piano accompanied by a solo instrument, violin for instance, which provide the perfect showcase for one of the great listed pianists, framed by the vocal and larger chamber works. But I think it's also fascinating to realize that, as well as Beethoven, he was being presented as two artists, both the composer of the moment, beginning his work at Schikaneder's Theatre, where he began working with the great Franz Clement. This not only led to the violin concerto, but the change of Leonora to Fidelio, which was all about collaboration. At the same time, he's one of a very short list of pianists. Of course, did you notice there's the great Josefa Barbara Auenhammer? So she not only had given the first performance of Beethoven's first piano concerto in 1801, and I kind of think this is amazing. She was a dedicatee of 4 of Mozart's sonatas for piano with violin, and she'd supervise all of his piano violin sonatas for publication. Just love the idea that we tend to forget that this was a very short period of time between the 1780s and the time this only under 20 years that these pieces were appearing. And this article reveals a change in concert practice that was beginning to happen, the creeping separation between the respective words of performer and composer. And Beethoven is presented as two people, as a composer and a great pianist. And gradually, observers begin to document the to and fro between composer and performer, and that's the relationship I want to explore a little bit today. It's worth noting that this division was beginning to be accelerated in Beethoven's case by, which are becoming a problem, because it denied him the pleasure of performing chamber music, because it was accelerated by his deafness. So first of all, it stopped him from playing on string instruments because of his famous intonation issue, and then stopped him playing chamber music from the piano, and then prevented his kind of expressive conducting, which I think you can say he may have pioneered. You might remember the disastrous occasion where he was conducting Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, and he forgot how the quiet scherzo double repeat was working, thought that he was conducting the forte section, and was conducting the forte section crouching low on the floor with his eyes closed as if he was conducting the pianissimo section, and was shocked to realize what had happened. This pushed him away from actual active performing. And the reason I wanted to say this was that increased his reliance on trusted teams of collaborators, and they became more and more important to him, and climaxed in 1825-6 with a very intense and to a degree public workshopping of the quartets Opus 131 and Opus 132, which were pretty much workshopped in public open session. It's also worth pointing out that the documentation of these processes always comes from observers and rarely from collaborators. And there are good reasons for this. They range from loyalty and confidentiality through to day-to-day realities. And this really hasn't changed. And there's a number of my composers, collaborating composers, who I really treasure in the room tonight. At any given time, I'm going to be in conversation with X number of those. And however much I might or might not be a public artist, and I talk about my interest and excitement in what I do, those conversations and collaborations and Skype, Zoom calls and Facebook messaging, phone calls, emails, and yes, letters are not usually for public consumption. So, for instance, for the past 2 months, I've been in intense conversation about the fabric and ideas of a major new concerto by one of my closest friends, and I'm involved to a greater or lesser degree in the development of the material and its shape. And I'm not going to tell anybody about the process that's ongoing, because part of the power of the workshop is that it's a safe space. And I'm bringing that up because I'd like to say something which I don't think gets said. I think that with all of Beethoven's, the very public and private crises and drama which surrounded him, I think you can say that this group of friends, associates, and you're going to see it's a complicated thing in a minute, was a safe space for him. It was somewhere he could go and work and be with these people who he trusted in that particular. Dare I say, to coin the phrase, it was often feels like his happy place, if I can say that. So when you read the descriptions from his childhood friend, Dr. Gerhard Wegler, of a workshop moment, this is rare because, as you can see, it's not the person who's having the moment with Beethoven, it's an observer. And that Beethoven's most assiduous collaborator, Ignaz von Schuppanzig, who we're concentrating on today, left no record whatsoever of their collaboration, which began in 1795 and lasted all the way till 1827, when he was pallbearer at Beethoven's funeral. There is no word from Schuppanzig at any point in all the correspondence of anything apart of the substance of their collaboration. So this is Wegler talking about a rehearsal moment. Anton Kraft pointed out to him that he should mark a passage in the second trio, that's from the Opus 1 set, on the G string, and that in the score of this trio, the finale, which Beethoven had marked 4/4, should be changed to 2/4. So this is referring to a moment in a quartet rehearsal led by Schuppanzig, and this was the second of his quartet lineups, established in 1805. Kraft had, of course, given the premiere of Haydn's D major concerto while he was the cellist in Nicholas Esterhazy's orchestra, where he'd met and studied and collaborated with that great composer. But his son, Nicholas, had been the cellist in the first of Schuppanzig's quartets. And the second lineup also included the young Josef Meitzeder, who was 15 when he joined, and Beethoven called the genius boy. And I said in my previous talk, collaboration is very much at the heart of what I want to talk about, and there's no person who enjoyed more regular collaboration over a greater period of time than Schuppanzig. And again, this is something which doesn't get said. Most of the musicians that Beethoven collaborated with were younger than him when he started working with him. Schuppanzig was 19 when Beethoven started working with him. Meitzeder was 15 when Beethoven started working with him in Vienna. This was a world of extraordinary, I don't want to use the word prodigies. And I wanted to bring this up because there's an awkward side to this. In collaboration, there's always hierarchy, whether it's acknowledged by either side, and it necessarily affects the outcome or outcomes. And I don't think it's necessary to qualify these as good or bad, just to recognize that the slant in relationships always affects the nature of the result. And it's certainly clear in the works which I'm going to talk about today, the Opus 30s, and later this week, the 47 and 96. Now, very few composers will be as candid about Beethoven as this, and I can't make up my mind about what I feel about it. This is in writing to Wegler. I regard Schuppanzig merely as an instrument on which to play when I feel inclined. But he can never be a noble witness to the fullest extent of my inward and outward activity, nor can he ever truly share my life. I value him merely for what he can do for me. That's pretty close to the bone. The two, of course, met when Beethoven moved into Alserstrasse 45, the building owned by Prince Lichnowsky, who was organizing the famous quartet sessions. And it seems that initially their violin lessons, which Beethoven took with him, which followed on from the quartet mornings, and then turned into workshops, involved music making, which Beethoven took part in both as a string player and a pianist. Experimentation, we know there was singing. We know the one thing which is repeated most in their correspondence between each other is alcohol. There's a lot of drinking. Mainly, that's what they write about to each other, who's going to bring the wine or the beer. And from 1795, the responsibility for these mornings was shared with the Russian ambassador, Count Razumovsky, who restricted his musical resources to a string quartet, which, it's worth saying, was still not the most popular chamber medium. The string quintet with two cellos was more popular, and other extended groups. The quartet didn't have the sense that we have today of it being this kind of, dare I say, holy relic. It's still working. The nature of the violin lessons which Beethoven had started with Schuppanzig changed, and his relationship with string instruments. Now, it's worth pointing out that comparatively late, you could still find him writing viola parts which were fitted to his hand and relative limitations. So if you, for instance, think of the viola part of the amazing Opus 25 Serenade for violin, flute, and viola, the violin part's horrendously difficult. The flute part's very challenging, and I know because I've played them all. The viola part is delightful, and all the impressive moments on the viola part are written in C major. So you can imagine why he would have constructed it like that. Before I talk a bit more about Schuppanzig, I think a little bit that in Beethoven's defense, and it is a dreadful letter, I recognize what he's talking about, because in the decades of collaboration I've enjoyed with living composers, there's always been different qualities of interchange, of interaction, each case and each particular. From the public-facing point of view, this can mean that collaborations will either be apparent or not. And of course, this is just as much the case with collaborations with composers. It's either public or not. We could all name pieces in which bits have been written by other composers who are either named or not. So, for instance, if you take the most famous piece of Australian string music, which is a piece called Port Essington by Peter Sculthorpe, the 18th century sounding music in the piece was written by the young David Matthews, who's not acknowledged on the score, but David was very, very close to Peter Sculthorpe, was delighted to do that. And I think I can say that I recognise that. For instance, I had a collaboration which was never public with Peter Maxwell Davis, where he would send me violin parts to work on, and I would adjust them and change them, and we talk about them, and then that will go into the finished score. That was not public at all. I was just delighted to work privately for him. That was a privilege, naturally. Because I think it's worth just noting again that Beethoven was 5.5 years older than Schuppanzig, and however that age gap seemed to get less important, that seems to have always been a slight undertow to their communication. If you think of the letter that he wrote to Hummel in 1799, that's a rather different relationship. More as a kind of jostling relationship between two guys who maybe respect each other a little more, although they're talking about Schuppanzig. So this is Beethoven writing to Hummel. Come to me this afternoon. You will find Schuppanzig here, and we shall both beat you up, cudgel you, and shake you so you have a thoroughly good time. Kisses from Your Beethoven, sometimes called Dumpling. Now, the dedications of Beethoven's accompanied piano sonatas, speak to this sense of hierarchies. And of course, that was enhanced by the constant social climbing, which was part and parcel of Viennese life at the beginning of the 1800s. So remember, the Opus 12 sonatas were dedicated to the most influential composer and teacher, the senior composer in Vienna at the end of the 1790s, Salieri. The Opus 23s and 24 to von Fries, like the Opus 29 string quartet, who was a powerful figure in the Masonic community, banking community, and gave access to the exclusive salons. And of course, the Opus 30s were dedicated to the rather alarming Tsar Alexander I, who may or may not have come to power in 1801 after killing his father. And he was celebrated in Vienna as a second Napoleon. And of course, Beethoven came to rely on the access which Schuppanzig increasingly offered as he grew more powerful, more influential, not only to the leading musicians who came through the salons in Vienna, but to the wheels within wheels of Viennese high society, that uneasy meeting point between first and second ranks of nobility. Anyway, I'd like to think about some of the ways in which Schuppanzig and Beethoven worked together. And these are visible in the working scores which survive particularly of these three sonatas. What's on your screen at the moment is one of the simplest manifestations of that. This is the beginning of the slow moves of Opus 13 number 1, this beautiful And I want to put this up because for two reasons. You'll see that that first page on the left there is very neat, very clear. And I'm going to come to why that is. These manuscripts are exquisite. And because they're so exquisite, they reveal the places, in my opinion, thinking about this for over a quarter of a century now, where intervention has happened in the rehearsal stage. Beethoven did not make separate copies of the violin parts for Schuppanzig's use. The first time he ever did that, we know, was in 1812, when he found himself having to make parts for Pierrot and the Archduke Rudolph for the Opus 96 sonata, and that's going to become important on Thursday. Rather, Schuppanzig played looking over Beethoven's shoulder at the manuscript score on the piano music desk, just like a continuo cellist did. The modern conceit as well of printing a piano score of sonata and chamber music with the string part in fainter type as a cue or mnemonic for the pianist was a long way off. And let's remember, the first score of any Beethoven chamber music, first full score, would not be published till 1825, which interestingly was the, at that time, incredibly celebrated, fantastic Opus 29 string quintet, which for some reason is not seen by enough people as the glory it is. So, the reason I put that other page there is because there's a little bit of the rehearsal process in front of you there. On the right-hand side, that is a repeat of the first page with a come prima scribbled across there, and you'll see it finds its way all the way down to that D major chord, which on that first page is visible. I can't see it right now. But the most important thing is that Beethoven was writing on separate sheets of paper. And this has been organized with the recto and verso so that when they did this, he could simply slide that first page across, they could play from it and then pull it away again. So he doesn't have to write it out, but he's made sure that first page is very neat because it keeps being pushed in whenever there's a come prima. I did warn you this was going to get a little nerdy. Beethoven's quite lazy. He doesn't like writing things out twice, but he needs to know that Schuppanzig can read it. So let's just kind of get into this a little bit more. So here's some of the things I find exciting about working with these manuscripts. The first thing, and I apologize, you can go and make coffee if you find this absolutely infuriating, is what we can learn from the fact that Beethoven was very messy with cutting pen nibs. This means that because he could never bring himself to cut the quill that he was writing with at the same thickness, you can usually tell not only when he's changed the temper marking of something, You can usually tell if it's lined up with something else. So this is the last movement of Opus 13 number 1. And you can see that originally doesn't have any substance to it. He's just made sure you know what it is. He's marked it allegretto con variazione. It's worth remembering that this movement had a rather interesting and complicated life, because at one point it was being used as the last movement for the Kreutzer Sonata, and then Beethoven wrote the new Kreutzer, the last movement with the big D minor episode in it to balance the big D minor episode in the first movement. We'll get to that. So stay with pen width. If I go to this next slide, look at that. So that's in the C minor manuscript, which he's working at the same time, and the same thing is happening. And I won't bore you with it, but if you measure those, you'll find, despite the fact these manuscripts are in 3 different libraries, one in Germany, one in Austria, one in the UK, that when he rationalized these manuscripts for printing, he went through them and lined some things up. Just like Mozart, when he went on his way to the printers to print this, seems to have had a change of heart about the tempo indication, and it went from the manuscript being andante to allegretto by the time he got to the printers. So these are kind of fun things which gradually point our way into the process. We're not talking really about collaboration at all here, but maybe this could be one of those. I know from working with composers and then working on practically every piece which involves a process of recapitulation, that the how do you bring the first material back is always an interesting, vexed question. And what I just showed you there is Beethoven having all kinds of second thoughts about how to bring back the opening of so yes, he's changed the dynamic of the recapitulation, he's reorganized the chord, there's scrubbing outs going on. This is the kind of stuff you start to play with. Still, I'm just going to play with this idea of adjusting of the big picture. It's not acknowledged how important it still was at this point for Beethoven to be writing sonatas in matched sets which had a relationship to each other. And I would argue that the Opus 30 set, which I'm going to get to the Tsar in a minute, their relationship, their various kind of thematic or their kind of character of each has as much of a kind of importance as the various characters of the 6 Brandenburg concertos. So if you think about the various characters of the 6 Brandenburg concertos, which range from the, they find their way to, they have hunting, you have war, and you find your way to the joyous pastoral of the B flat at the end with the violas. The similar thing happens here, that each of them has got, this one is similarly, the last movement of the last of these sonatas is pastoral. We have the when the last movement with the Hungarian or Scottish country dance, often it's impossible to tell the difference. I jumped into that too soon, but it was mainly because you can recognize the process of going and shuffling the pieces into a structure and saying, oh, that needs to happen here. Tempos get changed, expressive marks get changed. This is still nothing to do with the collaboration. Then we have something which is very charming with Beethoven, and I recognize from some composers who have less clear handwriting that he's very often ends up just writing the note names in there, so Schuppenziek and the printer can read clearly that he definitely wants a note G. And of course, the great thing about German is it's much easier to write the note names in than it is English, because in English we end up either writing F sharp or something, or putting a sharp sign, which then gets confused with the actual notation, where the best thing is that you've got more options in German, which is kind of nice. There's an H, there's a reassured B. Okay, let's now briefly diverge into the fact that Beethoven was still very much an active string player. He knows that this is from the Opus 30 number 1 still, that the string player here will do a series of extensions. into second position. And if you go to the open position number 3, he then requires you to stretch further. The notorious passage which most violinists cheat with, where he clearly wants this. I'll try and show you. There. Which is then doubled on the E string. So this is still his the knowledge of the technique that he very much has. Now I want to push into something which I'm passionate about and often gets me into trouble, and I'm going to say it anyway. At the very least, it's very clear to me that Beethoven's response to writing his music was so sensitized, if I can use that word, that every time he wrote anything, it reflected the character of what was going on to the page. So this is the beginning of this glorious Tempo di Minuetto. Actually, as you can see, he's had some doubts as to what to name this. Tempo di Minuetto ma molto moderato e grazioso. There's been, if anybody knows the title of the last movement of Mozart's last Fluke Quartet, which is even more extreme than this, you'll recognize the fun. But this is, so if you look what's going on here, the combination of late 18th and early 19th century convention of ties, which is something which tragically we've thrown away, and his use of the pen reveals so much. So if you've got the melody in the middle, then the accompanying line from the violin, you see the tie convention there. Modern notation has the ties going over the slurs, which is ridiculous because the lovely thing is the ties just over the bar line. But the most glorious thing, and I challenge any composer not to be, I just find it so, I've been looking at this score for all my life, that bass line, the wandering pen as he shapes the slur over that. Now, I'm not going to commit myself whether or not that simply happened because he had to find some way of shaping the slur to fit around it, or 2, because that seems to me to be related to the shape of the music and he's a musician, or 3, the possibility, and I'm on the fence, I've been on the fence for this for many years, that actually there may have been between him and his collaborators something going on there graphically. I'm not going to say any more than that. But look at this. This is the first 2 bars of the Opus 30, number 2. This is the piano part. Every single time that figure comes, every single time, there's that shimmy in the writing there. The whole way through the manuscript, that figure comes about 25 times in the first movement. Every single time, that tick happens on it. At the very least, for a performer, I think it behoves us to think about how we respond to that. And I'd also like to think about what messages he was giving to his collaborator, who of course was sight reading over his shoulder. This is a crucial thing. Rehearsal as such didn't exist. Workshops existed, doing things together existed, but most of what happened was prima vista in the context of the fact that Schuppanzig was intimately equated with what he was doing the whole time. And I can think of, actually there's enough of you here who I've worked with closely enough to recognize the process. If we're working with some of you on new pieces where I've been so close to it as the piece, when the piece emerged, that actually the learning process, to a greater or lesser degree, was the least part of it. Just before we get into actual collaboration, and this is something which, working today with the pianist Roderick Chadwick, we always talk about the joy of the mixed articulation of what he does. The fact that underneath this line, that there are gradients and curves going in different directions. Okay, this will be my last bit of precision engineering. This is something which has been completely ignored. There's a brief period between about 1801 to maybe about 1804, 1805, where Beethoven experiments with what you're seeing in front of you. This is to do with what I call the Christmas tree notation, which was central to how music was written on the page until well into the 19th century. Most of us know it, the fact that if you have a semi-breve, a whole note, it sits in the middle of the bar, 2 half notes, 2 minims, is go around them, a quarter notes, crotchets come down. You have all the early how to read music books had this laid out like this, which means you're always organizing music not from the beginning of the bar, but from the center of the bar. There's no left to right, which actually resolves the problem graphically. What the devil does the distance between a bar line and the first ictus of a note mean? What is that? That doesn't actually doesn't mean anything. So the reason I'm being a little bit of a nuisance about that is the figure you're looking at. So this is in the middle of the second movement of Opus 30, number 3. And you'll notice that each of those extended dotted notes has 2 dots on it. If you go and look in any score you'll buy today, you'll find that they get themselves into a bit of a pickle here. Most of them come up with the idea that the staccato dot, should go on the first note, which causes no end of arguments between players, I can tell you. Does that mean that you play this? Clearly, that's not it at all. The crucial thing, and this is where it gets really exciting, and I apologize those of you who've heard this before, is that Beethoven has lined up the staccato dot with the dot which extends the 8th note into being a dotted 8th note, into being a dotted quaver. It's a graphic indication, and it's consistent enough to tell you that at this stage, as opposed to doing what he would do by the time he comes to write, say, the Opus 101 Piano Sonata, in which case he'd simply write a 16th note rest at that point, that means that's the length you shorten the note by that amount. And the whole way through this movement, and whenever he uses it, he's very clear about that. I just wanted to show you that in order to point out that he's requiring extraordinary attention and precision from his collaborator. On Thursday, I'll talk a lot more about bowing, but it's worth saying that Beethoven, because he was a pianist, a violinist and a viola player as much as he was a pianist at the beginning, is very aware of the differences between the rhetoric of what the 2 instruments can achieve in terms of the intimate decoration. So you get a lot of what I will call Parisian bowing. So this figure, so you'll divide something up by 6 and then 2 groups of 3, or this kind of stuff. Which he never articulates, puts that kind of articulation and complexity of, it's almost like required elements in figure skating bowing in the piano part. Or, if I just jump ahead to here, the way that Beethoven writes up bows. There not a single place in Beethoven where it indicates up and down bows, but in terms of convention of the time, that's a series of notated up bows. This is all by way of just bringing us to the actual collaboration. The next thing, you remember, those of you here on last week, I talked about Beethoven's use of a Bachkian barriolage at the end of the first movement of Opus 132. Which is notated with separate note heads. He's close enough to the 18th century that you can expect that if he writes something like this, that he wants the jarring jingle jangle of open strings. He has that in his head. Just as much as he knows, for instance, that if he wants to get the player to end a movement with a bow in the air, if you look carefully at the third bar on your screen there, if he slurs the first 2 notes of this, it does that. Now that, just in terms of compositionally and showing you how these 3 pieces are linked together, that's the end of the Opus 30 number 1 first movement, and he repeats that figure 3 times, exactly in the same pitch in the Opus 30 number 3. But the whole point about those slurring is to get that gesture of the flying bow at the end. And the last thing I want to talk about before I get to Chopin conceiving himself is his incredible interest in colour. I've put up 2 things. Here we have his notation for the end of the slow movement of Opus 30 number 1, where you have senza sordino in the piano. That means it's pedaled, so it's notated upside down. Senza sordino means the pedal is down, with a pizzicato on the top. And what I've put in the back of, I don't know whether it's been covered up, I hope it's not been covered up by your faces, the last few bars of the triple concerto, which notated with the whole orchestra playing eighth note, dry eighth note chords, with the piano pedaled across the rest. It's something he really, really loved. Okay, let's get back to some people. I was saying that I was going to talk a bit about the dedicatee of these sonatas. Beethoven was somewhat, well, you have to ask the questions to who he chose to dedicate pieces to. But he was in awe of this dashing young Tsar who'd come to power in the year before he started working on these pieces in 1802. Alexander came to Vienna, and he was feted as a hero, lionized both as a soldier and a kind of epitome of a modern monarch. And the reason I wanted to put him up here is that, one of the things you hear is this idea of the pieces talking about this man's qualities. So, for instance, the Opus 30 number 2 is full of representations of warfare. It's got fanfares, it's got drum rolls, gunshots, victory, paeans of victory, and even the kind of thing you get in Bieber, the moaning of wounded soldiers. They're clearly recognizable. The kind of martial extremity of this piece used to lead to a lot of confusion. And one of my very serious teachers suggested to me that the canonades in the middle of the slow movement, and this was a bit embarrassing because I was too young to have a fight with him, was Beethoven's memory of hiding in the cellar of the Schwarzenspanier house with his hands over his ears while the French bombarded Vienna. It's a great story, but the siege of Vienna didn't happen until the 11th of May 1809. Beethoven was in the cellar with his pillows over his ears and, ironically trying to distract himself by working on the Emperor Piano Concerto, which you've got to say is pretty weird. And Haydn was made very ill with this, and his sage servants were overwhelmed with panic. But it had nothing to do with that. But you can understand where it's coming from. There's a fun story behind this. Alexander gave Beethoven a diamond as down payment for these sonatas. I'm sure most composers would be quite pleased to be given a diamond as down payment for 3 piano violin sonatas. But the composer complained later that he'd never received payment in full. For it seems that no figure was ever discussed by the two of them. And in December 1814, during the Congress of Vienna, which ended the war, a slightly mysterious figure named Dr. Bertolini appears in the story, and in the Kinsky Verzeichnis you can kind of unpick this. And he was either a kind of court functionary or civil servant, and he came up with a way of solving the impasse. The Tsarina, who I've put up there with one of the 2 wonderful portraits which Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun painted of her in Russia. She was originally a German princess. Of course, she became Tsarina Elizabeth, but she was born the Princess Marie Louise Augustina von Baden, and she'd married Alexander in 1793. And Bertolini came up with the idea that Beethoven could take advantage of Tsarina's craze for polonaises, which had overtaken Vienna. In fact, Maidsaeder, who was known as the Polonaise king by this point. And the idea was that they would get permission to compose a polonaise for the Tsarina. Then when the opportunity to present it offered itself, her delight at the offering would bring up the opportunity to talk about her husband's missing payment for the sonatas. Now, the trouble was Beethoven was very unhappy with the plan. He averred that he hated polonaises, although he did write a couple of polonaises, if you think of the last movement of the triple concerto. Anyway, Bertolini prevailed, and the two of them sat uncomfortably in the receiving room of the Russian suite of the Razumovsky Palace for 2 whole days to ask permission of the court chamberlain to make the dedication. And that chamberlain, who was Count Piotr Volkonsky, gave them the permission. So they were given permission to do that, so then Beethoven had to write the piece. And get over his dislike of writing polonaises. So what happened was, and this is documented, the composer sat at his piano and Bertolini reclined on a nearby sofa, and Beethoven came up with melody after melody until Bertolini said, that's the one. And that was a short process to complete the piece, which is pretty substantial. It's his Opus 89 Grand Polonaise, and then was presented to the Tsarina wrapped and tied up with a red ribbon. And she played it. He played it for her. The Tsarina was absolutely enchanted and pushed 50 ducats into Beethoven's hand. And you can imagine the kind of beat at that moment. And then she said, "Didn't you write some sonatas for my husband before? They're wonderful." And Beethoven, we don't know anything about Beethoven's reaction, but we know that another 100 ducats was handed over, and the happy pair, composer and broker, left in triumph. I wonder if Bertolini was working on commission. So let's now get to the substance of it. I just put this up here, and I apologize, there are composers in the room. I just gathered some pictures of how much I love this process of working together, being around all the things that we like to do, round table over drinks, rehearsal situations. I think this is something which Beethoven recognized and valued very highly. So, the most obvious thing that happens with the compositional process is a dynamic being adjusted. So if you look on that example there, a forte has been scrubbed out and replaced with a decrescendo to piano. And this is very prosaic, I know. You go from... So... has found its way in. Here's a more extreme example of dynamics being scrubbed out. Think of the number of times you may sat in a rehearsal with a composer and you're going, how do we get this to work? That's not quite working right. It can be a question of balance, a question of colour, a question of rhetoric. And it doesn't matter how good the ear of everybody involved, there's always that moment in a rehearsal when you say, that needs adjusting. And this is what we're really looking at here. This is one that fascinates me on the screen now. This is, originally, Beethoven had lined up two crescendos vertically on top of each other. So the crescendo on the violin part is above the piano, and then it's been shifted to the left. So there's a canonic change, if you like, to dynamics. And this is something which is very much a feature of these sonatas, dynamics not being lined up. Here we have something which you find all the time, which is removing of forte. So in this case, from here, has become... I said last time that Beethoven was one of the first composers to experiment with the idea of a lyrical line which remains lyrical whilst being punctuated, or even sometimes punched by sforzandi. Okay, I'm showing these because I now want to talk about where I think the collaborative relationship may have verged into the abusive. So here's three chords from Opus 30, number 2. So from the first movement, that martial first movement. It's an obvious thing that we won't be surprised to hear that Beethoven, with the exception of when he writes Baroque dragged chords such as this, doesn't write 4-note chords to be played piano in general. But look at this. This is part of the last set of variations from Opus 30, number 1. And we have here something which I was introduced to by a teacher who'd not seen this manuscript. So we have these chords marked piano. And they are violinists are understandably neurotic about going on stage and playing piano 4-note chords delicately enough without cheating and just spreading them. And so I was delighted when I first saw this score and saw what's going on there, which is clear. Originally, they were exactly what you would expect. They were big fortes, piano. I think we can start talking about the idea of what happened between the two of them. There's a picture of collaboration I really love. It's a photograph, which I do urge you to try and find, of Stravinsky with his great collaborator, Samuel Dushkin. And they're playing Stravinsky's at the piano, playing the piano with one hand, and he's got his other hand on Dushkin's bowing arm. And I kind of recognize what's going on there, because there have been many times when a composer has said to me, no. And if you think about that relationship between Schuppanzig and Beethoven, I have a feeling that one of the things he quite enjoyed doing was to suppress the things that Schuppanzig felt comfortable. Even by this stage, Schuppanzig was famous for his weight. And a couple of years later, Beethoven was going to write a large and really unbelievably cruel piece with the title A musikalischer Scherz, Lob auf den Dicken, hymn to the fat one, which begins with soloists singing Schuppanzig ist ein Lump, Lump, Lump. Now, I am not... This is just the way I find my way into this process. I imagine that in the rehearsal we got to that Schuppanzig was reading over Beethoven's shoulder and he went, oh, great. And Beethoven went, no, sir. Now, we know from his collaborations with Bridgetower, which I'll talk about on Thursday, that when Bridgetower talked about that collaboration, he was fond of shouting out yes and no when he enjoyed something. So I imagine him going, just raising an eyebrow. Out comes the pen. Of course, crucially at this moment, the music would have to be put flat, and he scrubs that piano over it. He makes his friend uncomfortable. And I think that's... And you see, look at this. So here's the original version of the beginning of Opus number 13, number 3. One of the most glorious manuscripts I've ever had the privilege to hold. I've held this one. So it's well known because it begins piano. Super fortando. Forte. That's clearly not originally what was there. It began forte. Not only did it begin forte, it began forte with sforzandi on every single note. And again, it may have been, if they were rehearsing these pieces at a similar time, it could have been that either in the rehearsal or afterwards, Beethoven decided it would be fun to spoil Schuppanzig's fun. I know I'm speculating. I've been telling myself this story for many years and I've lived with it for so long. This helps me understand a little bit about the piece. Because from a performer or a composer's point of view, you tell me that you wouldn't like to know if a piano dynamic was a suppressed forte as opposed to being a natural piano. These are different things, and I think they're exciting to know. Okay, practical, boring stuff. This is absolutely the stuff of a collaborative process where Beethoven has taken an accompanying figure in the violin, which and originally he writes as, and you can imagine him thinking that's rather boring, so he then turns it into in fact, the funny thing is that you could argue that he's made it interesting by making it more prosaic, and in order to make sure that we know what's going on, he's written in the missing notes. Here we have the thing where he's been experimenting with figuration going over a bar line and then pulling it back. So originally, this is from that variation movement, which originally the violin goes over the bar line, and then he just simplifies it and removes that first beat. Again, one of the reasons we know is this eternal problem of, or the useful thing that Beethoven gets messier the more he gets involved in something. I did say this the other day, I'm going to repeat it, and I know from my own experience that I'll often set out to, say, work in, say, a recording situation, say, where I'm producing myself and I've got a list of takes, and I'll set out and I'll make a graph and a grid to write on, and damn it, by the end of the evening, 4.5 hours, 5 hours in, I look at my notes, and what began very, very tidily are completely indecipherable as I get more involved in the music. It's natural for musicians that the more we get involved in music, the less we are, less we are able to read the notes we did afterwards. The great composer, Irish composer Melanie Dakin, to whom I was very close, who's a pupil of Messiaen, wrote a huge piano string orchestra piece for me when I was 18. And she wrote a set, which she told me she was writing a set of violin studies at the same time. She had this notebook with them. Mel had the most glorious calligraphic, bird-like handwriting you've ever seen. Those at the Academy know we find her writing scrawled over scores in the Academy Library so often. It's always a treat. And after we'd premiered the big new piece, I said, I'm interested in those violin studies. And she said, Peter, I'm really sorry. I went to the notebooks and I don't have a faintest idea what they mean. She'd been scrawling hieroglyphics and birds into them. I've never seen them. She wouldn't show them to me. I kind of recognise that. Next, there's the kind of afterthought material where you have, you may have to adjust it so you can see this, where Beethoven has written something and realises in a rehearsal process, and you can always tell that he's had to extend those, he's really being careful to write the score neatly, and of course when he extends it he has to draw the staves out. There's at least one composer here I know who's very interested in what happens when you jam things in at the end of a line. This is very much in his spirit. Another one here, 2 additional bars. Now, every composer and every musician is going to recognize this, that you organize something architecturally, you organize something in terms of key structure and rhetoric and everything, and then you realize in a rehearsal that it's prosaic, or you need to adjust the pitch and yaw of it, you need to add something, you need to take something out. This is my favorite, where in the in this section of the last movement of the C major, this glorious kind of bird song in the fields kind of thing. This is almost illegible because the photocopy was done rather horribly at in Berlin. I apologise. This is a fold-out paste-in where Beethoven adds a little excursion to an extra 7 or 8 bars just to draw you away from the inevitability of what he is doing. And here's a really favourite one of mine. So this is in the first movement of Opus 30, number 3, when we have this and what we all know is the piano plays, and originally it was a unison, which actually would work beautifully, and I tried it in rehearsal today and I was kind of mourning I never get the chance to do that. It's kind of wonderful, but he's too good a composer. He knows that very often the best thing to do is to take away the obvious thing. There's all the obvious things of octave redistributions, and then the other thing, the corollary to the extension of things, increasing the speed, the trajectory of getting to an ending by cutting stuff out. And this is in the and as it gets more impassioned towards some of the sections, we have originally 4 bar and he cuts out 2 bars, so you end up being tripped up sooner. Or in the middle there is a whole, you'll recognize a section where the piano and the violin are exchanging. At one point there was a rather, well, I have to say would have been rather tension removing thing where the violin played while the piano played. Clearly that seemed like a great idea, perhaps until they did it in a rehearsal. And here's the thing which I really love about what composers do. And I've experienced this whether they realised it or not from so many of them, which conducting either with the way they hold themselves or the way that the pen is going over the paper. The first time this was done to me, for me it was amazing. It was when I was first working with Henze and I was playing the bit of a piece he wrote for me. I was very, very ridiculously young to be working with him, and as I played it, his pencil traced a shape on the paper. I've still got that bit of paper. And this is this glorious bridge passage in the slow movement we're about to hear. And first of all the violin plays in. And look at that handwriting. I'm tempted, I know it's rubbish, I'm tempted by the idea that the Schuppanzig was playing and Beethoven, you can almost see the pen going onto the page that he's writing. This is as close, seeing that, the drama of that, the decrescendo looming out of the page like that. It's just fantastically expressive. But on the other side, when Beethoven wanted to be, he was very concerned to make sure that really exact rubato when he wanted it was notated. And look at this. So this is this fantastic back and forth. So we have, he doesn't want any confusion about this. Even though there's been all kinds of new articulations going in there. Look at the question over figuration. So this figure here, where he's changed what was originally, or I think it was probably slurs the whole way to this. On Thursday, I will talk a lot about the relationship between Vienna and Paris. But there's a really big question going on here, which is how much was Beethoven able to take advantage during his lifetime of the new bow technology coming from Paris? The answer was a lot and not. Because, of course, in 1799, when Bernadotte had arrived in Vienna to negotiate with the Hofburg as to how they would surrender when Napoleon eventually arrived, he brought with him Rodolphe Kreutzer. It's when Beethoven met him for the first time, which was why eventually Beethoven made the very ill-advised decision to rededicate the Bridge Tower Sonata to him. So Kreutzer would have come bringing the Tourte technology. But of course the war intervened, and it wouldn't be until 1809, with the fall of Vienna, when the flow backwards and forwards from Paris to Vienna began again. So there's a big question mark as to how technology was moving around. But the crucial thing about this is that, I just want to put this in everybody's ear, is that the one thing that this design bow, which has become invented in the late 1770s, but becomes in general use by the mid-1790s, the one thing it was and remains astonishing for is variety of articulation, complicated articulation. An example would be if you take something from, say, in Mozart's Sinfonie Constante, for instance. We know that Mozart was in touch with Tourte technology pretty early. And an example, if you slow down this passage, that's an example of what I call pure Parisian bowing, where you explore the fact that the bow will go through the bow, two little bows at the end, and it gives, as Paganini later said about this type of bow, égalité de résistance avec toute la longueur de lâcher. Equal resistance every point in the bow. The bow will function equally expressively everywhere. So when you see bowings like this, finding their way in at the end of the 18th century, and much more complex combinations than that, and Beethoven is using them a lot, that's a sign that these new technologies are arriving. But I don't want to commit myself anymore until I can talk about Rhode later, which I'm not going to do today. Really prosaic things happen in the rehearsal process, going from accompanying material where you have this kind of Viennese to sustained chords, and then dramatic adjustments of colour, as you can see there. I began talking about the graphic nature of what we see on the page. And I think this is very evident here, that Beethoven is incapable of not responding to what's going on. But I want to just kind of bring this to moving towards a conversation by moving a little bit away from the workshop. Because the most important customers, and I'm going to use that word carefully, for these sonatas were the sheet music buying general public. And no one was more important for how that public made choices as to what they bought to play for fun than the critics. And I'm going to open this because I can't resist talking about it. I am a devotee of YouTube unboxing videos. If you don't know what I'm talking about, write unboxing into YouTube and your life will end. I'll leave that and I'm going to come back to it. That's a nice Gauge 1 Märklin engine there, which I want. It only costs about £10,000. Now, the reactions of the critics were always impassioned. And if you remember the review of the Opus 12 piano violin sonatas, I felt like someone who'd expected to go for a walk with a congenial friend only to find myself enmeshed in thorn bushes. That's the reviewer. Got to ask what's going on there. Because the reviews documented the act of the reviewer getting the music, going home, sitting at the piano, putting it on the piano, opening it, and playing and recording their reactions in real time. If these guys had had access to the technology we're using it right now, they would be posting it in real. Oh, I don't like that. Can't do that. It's absolutely almost unfiltered reaction. Listen, and as I said, if you want to see that happening right now, and the set of rules for doing it with unboxing videos is exactly that. There's, you get the thing, you look at the label, you open it, you look at the packaging, you take the instructions out, then you take it out gently, and then 15 minutes into it, you say, it doesn't work. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about dishwashers, railway engines, it's all the same. And it's very similar to this. This is the review of the A major sonata, the least played and in many ways the most glorious of the set of three sonatas, from November the 6th, 1803, a few months after this was published. It's worth reading. If something pedestrian ever escapes men of intellect, from whom one usually hears something witty, one is easily inclined to believe that they were not entirely understood, or that somewhere in their words there must be a subtly hidden point. The reviewer had approximately the same experience with this sonata. Although he only rarely discovered in the piece a trace of this composer of so many original and excellent things, nevertheless he continued to mistrust his judgment, until he had finally played it through several times, and his experience, his expectations still remained unsatisfied several times. Now, by no means does it follow that this sonata is pedestrian. Indeed, for such a thing cannot follow from, and I quote exactly, Mr. B's pen. However, the reviewer is confident in saying that it is not entirely worthy of him, and he appeals to Mr. Von B's own sense of feeling for corroborations. I love the idea the composer should look into their heart and ask whether this is truly worthy of them. Thus, the first movement does not quite have the beautiful flow of thoughts one meets with in his later works. The first movement of this sonata is one of those beautifully flowing things ever written. For that reason, it quite naturally lacks a definite character, especially in his later works. Lacks definite character. Also, the third movement, an allegretto with variations, is not entirely successful. At the very least, it should have been easy for Mr. VB to create even more valuable ideas from the theme. He's talking about this wonderful... He's right, you create many valuable ideas from that theme. He does create many valuable ideas from that theme. The reviewer just doesn't get it. In the pure opinion of this reviewer, something like this, here we go, could only happen to Mr. B while writing in great haste, or at best, when he was in an entirely unfortunate mood and was indulging himself whilst improvising. As a sincere admirer of Mr. B's work, the vast majority of which are excellent, the review would regret it greatly if he couldn't add to these remarks his assurance that in spite of the faults reproved here, the sonata distinguished itself very favourably from an unfortunately large number of new keyboard sonatas. It deserves to be known particularly for the sake of its second movement, a very beautiful adagio solidly sustained by a melancholic quality that is quite worthy of the best Beethoven adagios. One would have thought that if he liked that, he wouldn't be putting the boot in quite as much. He's referring to the thing I began with, this. Beyond this, the sonata is also by far not as difficult to perform as most of his works. It's interesting that in this review, an interesting suggestion has been made, which is that Beethoven shouldn't be indulging with something which could have the quality of improvising. Now, this is 1803 this is being written, and that's kind of fascinating to see that clear water is being demanded between one and the other. That's sort of amazing to me, and that's something which brings us very much to the collaboration, the mephitic collaboration with George August Polgreen Bridge Tower.